The moment Karen's scream cut across the water like a siren, I knew the sign had worked better than I ever imagined, because 1 second the lake was glass smooth with morning mist curling off it, and the next there was this sharp, furious voice echoing from the gravel path, as if someone had stepped on a live wire, and I turned just in time to see her standing there, red-faced, phone already raised, shaking with rage, staring at the wooden board I had bolted to my own fence the night before, and even before she finished reading it out loud I could tell this was going to be one of those days that would be retold for years, because nothing unravels an HOA Karen faster than being told no, especially when the no is carved into wood and planted firmly on land she does not own, and the words "private lake no Karens allowed" had barely been up 12 hours before she arrived, acting like I had personally declared war on her entire personality, and as she stomped closer in flip-flops not designed for gravel, screaming about disrespect and rules and community standards, my mind flashed back to how we even got here, because this lake had been my quiet escape for almost a decade, long before her subdivision sprouted up like mushrooms after rain, long before matching mailboxes and laminated HOA packets, and long before Karen decided that anything she could see must belong to her by default. And when I bought this place, the realtor had been very clear: private lake, deeded separately, surveyed twice, and fenced legally, but that had never stopped neighbors from wandering down with floaties and fishing poles, smiling like they had every right to be there, and I had tolerated it, at first waved politely, explained gently, even printed maps, but politeness only feeds entitlement, and Karen had been the worst of them, because she did not ask, she announced, she did not listen, she corrected, and she did not care what the deed said, because in her mind the HOA handbook outranked county records, and the first time she marched onto my dock months ago, clipboard in hand, telling me I needed to remove my no trespassing sign because it was offensive. I laughed, thinking it was a joke, and that laugh haunted me now as she jabbed her finger toward the new sign, yelling loud enough for birds to scatter and neighbors to peer from behind curtains while filming, because she was furious, not just because she was excluded, but because she had been named, and Karen hated nothing more than being called exactly what she was, and she demanded I take it down immediately, citing rules that did not apply, claiming children would be traumatized, guests would be confused, and property values would collapse, all because of a sign on land she did not own. And as I stepped onto the dock barefoot, coffee still in my hand, I felt that calm settle in, the kind that comes when you know you are right, and you know the other person is about to dig themselves into a hole with a backhoe, and I reminded myself to breathe, because the last thing Karen wanted was logic. She wanted a scene, and unfortunately for her I had given her a stage, and she went full performance mode, pacing, waving her phone, narrating for whatever audience she imagined, telling them she was being harassed, discriminated against, targeted by hate speech, while pointing dramatically at the sign, and when I calmly told her she was trespassing she gasped, as if I had slapped her, and that word trespassing flipped a switch, because suddenly she was screaming about calling the police, the HOA, the county, the news, anyone who would listen, and the irony was almost painful, because she was the one standing illegally on my land, threatening me for enforcing my rights, and I could already see the pattern forming, because Karen never stopped at one threat, she stacked them like dominoes, hoping one would scare me into compliance, and when that failed she would escalate. So while she ranted I thought about the survey tucked safely in my desk, the lawyer email saved in my phone, the sheriff deputy who had already explained to me months earlier that posting a sign was not just allowed but recommended, and that memory steadied me as Karen stormed closer, demanding I remove it immediately or face consequences she could not actually define, and I told her calmly that the sign was staying, and that, if she did not leave, I would call the sheriff myself, and that suggestion sent her into a fresh spiral, because in her world only she called authorities, and being told she was not in control made her voice crack with fury as she screamed that I was violating community harmony, that she would fine me daily, that the HOA would sue, that my dock would be removed, that my lake would be seized, and it was almost impressive how confidently wrong she was, and as neighbors gathered pretending to walk dogs or check mail, while clearly watching the spectacle, Karen noticed the audience, and leaned into it, performing outrage for them, telling everyone how I was selfish, hoarding natural resources excluding families and ruining summer fun, and I realized then that this was no longer just about a sign or a lake. This was about her authority being challenged publicly, and she could not let that stand. And as she kept talking I saw her phone tilt just enough to catch my face and the sign behind me, and I knew she was recording, trying to bait me into a viral clip where she would be the victim, and I smiled, because that smile drove her absolutely insane. And I told her once more calmly that the lake was private, that the sign was legal, and that she needed to leave now. And when she screamed that she would have me removed instead, something shifted, because this was the moment where her threats crossed into something actionable, and I felt that strange mix of anticipation and disbelief, because I knew the next steps would not go the way she imagined. And as she stomped back toward the path, yelling that this was not over, and that she would be back with papers, officers, and witnesses, I looked at the sign again, steady and solid in the morning light, and I understood that what I had started with a bit of humor and frustration was about to become a full-blown war of entitlement versus reality, and chapter 1 of a story that would end with Karen learning a very public, very painful lesson about private property and the power of a simple word, no. By the time the gravel settled from Karen's dramatic exit, I already knew she would not cool off or reconsider, because people like her do not retreat, they reload, and that afternoon proved it when the quiet of the lake was replaced by the unmistakable sound of a golf cart buzzing down the path like an angry hornet, and I looked up to see Karen again, this time flanked by two neighbors I barely recognized, both wearing the stiff, uncomfortable expressions of people dragged into a conflict they did not understand but felt obligated to support, because Karen had already framed the story for them, and she did not even step onto the dock this time. She stopped at the fence line, planted her feet, and announced loudly that she had witnesses now, as if the presence of an audience magically rewrote property law, and she pointed at the sign again, reading it out with exaggerated pauses, as though emphasizing the words would somehow make them illegal, and she declared that it was offensive, discriminatory, and in violation of community standards. And when I calmly asked which standards she meant, she waved her hand dismissively and said everyone knew what she meant, because in her mind vague authority was stronger than actual rules. And the two neighbors nodded uncertainly, glancing between us, clearly uncomfortable but unwilling to contradict her, and Karen seized on their silence, using it as proof that the entire neighborhood was against me, launching into a speech about shared spaces and how lakes should belong to everyone and how selfishness destroys communities. And I could see the irony sailing right past her, because the only selfishness on display was her belief that ownership only applied to other people and not her. And I listened without interrupting, because experience had taught me that Karen would always talk herself into a corner if given enough rope, and sure enough she began making claims that were so wildly inaccurate they bordered on parody, saying the HOA charter gave them access rights, saying the developer promised lake usage, saying the county would side with families over individuals. And when I asked if she had any of this in writing, she scoffed and said she did not need paperwork because everyone knew. And that was when I told her that opinions did not override deeds, and that if she wanted to continue this discussion she should do it through her lawyer, not on my shoreline. And that suggestion again struck a nerve, because Karen hated the idea of professional boundaries. She wanted confrontation, not resolution, and she snapped back that lawyers were unnecessary when the HOA handled things internally, and she would be reporting me for harassment for creating a hostile environment. And I almost laughed at the absurdity of being accused of harassment by someone who kept trespassing on my land uninvited and yelling at me, but I kept my voice, even because calm unnerved her more than anger ever could. And I told her once again that the lake was private and that the sign would remain, and that she and her witnesses were currently trespassing and should leave. And that was when one of the neighbors finally spoke up, quietly asking if the lake was really on my deed. And Karen whipped around so fast it was like watching someone interrupt a spell, because doubt was contagious and she could not allow it to spread. And she cut the neighbor off, saying it was complicated and not the point, and then turned back to me, declaring that even if the lake was technically mine, the HOA could still regulate signage and behavior, and I explained patiently that the HOA had no jurisdiction over my land or my signage, and that their authority stopped at the subdivision boundary, which did not include my property, and that explanation landed hard, because it exposed the flaw in her entire argument, and she responded the only way she knew how, by raising her voice and accusing me of lying and threatening to call the police right now, and I welcomed that idea, telling her she was free to call whoever she liked, and that invitation rattled her because she expected fear, not permission, and she hesitated long enough for one of the neighbors to pull out their phone and quietly search something, which Karen noticed immediately and snapped at them to stop undermining her, and that small crack in her support seemed to fuel her anger even more, because she realized she needed to regain control of the narrative quickly, so she pivoted, announcing she would be calling an emergency HOA meeting that evening to address my behavior, and that fines would be issued and legal action taken, and she would make sure the entire community knew what kind of person I was, and she promised that sign would come down one way or another. And then she turned dramatically and stormed back to the golf cart, barking orders at the neighbors to follow her, leaving behind an awkward silence that felt heavier than the shouting. And as they drove off, I stood there looking at the lake, still calm, still mine, and I felt that strange mix of annoyance and anticipation again, because now Karen had escalated beyond personal confrontation into organized retaliation, and I knew that meant paperwork, threats, and public shaming were coming next. And while part of me wished she would just give up, another part of me recognized that this was the phase where entitlement usually collapsed under its own weight, because when people like Karen try to weaponize rules they do not understand against facts, they cannot change. The outcome is rarely subtle, and as I went back inside, I started gathering documents, surveys, emails, legal notes, not out of fear but preparation, because Karen believed volume equaled power, and I knew evidence would speak louder than any scream. And that night, as the sun set over the lake, casting long reflections across the water, I realized this was no longer just about keeping people out, it was about drawing a line that had been ignored for too long. And Karen had just declared war on a boundary she never bothered to respect, and the next move would not be hers alone anymore. The HOA meeting happened exactly the way I expected, which meant it was louder, more chaotic, and far more dramatic than any reasonable gathering of adults should be. And even though it was technically being held in the clubhouse of Karen's subdivision, I was invited in the same way one invites a defendant to their own trial, because the notice taped to my mailbox that afternoon was less a request and more a declaration that my presence was required to answer for my actions. And I almost admired the confidence with which Karen assumed authority over land and people she did not control, but I still showed up calm and prepared, carrying a folder that weighed more than her entire argument. And the moment I walked in, every head turned, because she had clearly primed the room already, and I could feel the tension crackle as whispers followed me to the chair at the far end of the table, where Karen sat front and center, arms crossed, lips tight, wearing the satisfied expression of someone who believed the outcome was already decided, and she wasted no time launching into a speech about community values and respect, and how my sign had created division and discomfort and unsafe feelings. And she spoke with the practiced cadence of someone who loved the sound of her own outrage, while nodding supporters murmured agreement, and the board members exchanged uncertain glances, because even they seemed unsure why this issue had escalated so quickly. And when Karen finally paused for breath, she gestured toward me, dramatically inviting me to explain myself, as if I were a child caught misbehaving, and I thanked her for the opportunity, which earned an eye roll. And then I calmly explained that my property, including the lake, was not part of the HOA, that I had posted the sign after repeated instances of trespassing, and that nothing about it violated any law or regulation. And before I could continue, Karen interrupted loudly, declaring that intent did not matter because impact mattered, and that the impact was harm and exclusion, and that the HOA would not tolerate hate speech. And the room murmured again, but this time it was less certain and more confused, because calling a sign hate speech stretched credibility even for her. And I asked politely to finish, which she begrudgingly allowed, and I opened my folder, laying out the survey maps, deed copies, and correspondence with the county. And as the papers spread across the table, the energy shifted because evidence has a way of doing that, and I explained that the lake had been surveyed separately, that access was never granted to the subdivision, and that the HOA charter itself explicitly stated it had no authority beyond the platted boundaries, and one of the board members leaned forward squinting at the documents while Karen scoffed dismissively, saying paperwork could say anything, and what mattered was community intent, and that was when I asked if anyone on the board had actually read the charter, because intent without authority meant nothing, and that question landed hard because no one answered immediately, and Karen tried to fill the silence, accusing me of legal intimidation and trying to bully the board with technicalities, but the damage was done because doubt had crept in, and once doubt appears, entitlement starts to unravel, and a board member finally spoke, asking Karen if the lake was indeed outside their jurisdiction, and she snapped that it should not matter because the HOA was responsible for maintaining harmony, and then another member asked if the sign violated any specific rule, and Karen responded vaguely, saying it violated the spirit of inclusion, which earned a few uncomfortable shifts in chairs, and I could see her losing control of the narrative, so she escalated again, accusing me of provoking residents, intentionally mocking them, and targeting her personally, and that last part made a few people glance her way because she had said the quiet part out loud, and I took that moment to clarify that the sign was not about her personally but about stopping repeated trespassing, and that if she felt targeted it might be because she had been the most frequent offender, and that statement triggered her like a spark to dry grass, and she launched into a furious rant about respect and threats, and how she would not be silenced, and how she would take this to the county, the press, the courts, and anyone who would listen, and the board president finally intervened, asking her to calm down and reminding everyone that the meeting was to determine jurisdiction, not feelings, and that interruption enraged Karen because authority questioned is authority threatened, and she turned on the board, accusing them of weakness and failure, and I watched as support quietly drained from her, because nothing alienates allies faster than attacking them, and as voices overlapped and tempers flared, the board president called for order and announced that based on the documents presented, the HOA had no authority over my property or my signage, and therefore could not issue fines or demands related to it, and the room went silent except for Karen's sharp intake of breath, and she protested loudly, insisting they were wrong, that they were abandoning the community, that they would regret this, and she demanded a vote to overturn the decision, but the board declined, stating it was not a matter of opinion, and that was the moment when Karen realized she had overplayed her hand because her power depended on unquestioned control, and now that control had slipped, and she stood abruptly, knocking her chair back, declaring that this was not over and that she would handle it herself, and stormed out of the room, leaving behind a stunned silence and a few awkward coughs, and as people began to gather their things, some approached me, quietly apologizing for the situation, admitting they had not known the facts, and I nodded politely, because the truth has a way of clarifying things eventually, and as I walked out into the evening air I felt the strange calm that comes when the tide finally turns, because Karen had just lost her first real battle, and instead of backing down she had chosen to escalate alone, and that meant the next chapter would not be fought in meeting rooms or with words but out in the open, where consequences were harder to avoid. The next escalation came sooner than I expected, and with far less subtlety, because 2 days after the HOA meeting I woke to the unmistakable sound of voices arguing near the shoreline, and when I stepped outside I found Karen standing at the edge of my dock, flanked by 2 uniformed sheriff deputies, gesturing wildly toward the lake, as if she were presenting evidence in a courtroom drama, and the moment she saw me she straightened, visibly adopting that practiced posture of righteous authority she always used when she believed power had arrived to validate her, and she began speaking over the deputies, explaining how I had posted an offensive sign, refused to comply with HOA rules, and was harassing residents by denying access to what she claimed was a shared resource, and as she spoke she kept glancing at me with a thin, triumphant smile, clearly convinced that this was the moment everything would finally go her way, and I listened, quietly waiting, because experience had taught me that Interruptions only fueled her performance, and when she finally paused for breath, one of the deputies turned to me calmly asking if the lake was private property, and I told him yes, and offered to show documentation, and that simple exchange cracked her confidence because she immediately jumped in insisting that HOA rules superseded individual ownership, and that the sign constituted provocation and discrimination, and the deputy raised a hand gently signaling her to stop talking, and asked if she had any documentation proving HOA jurisdiction over my land, and she sputtered briefly before saying it was understood within the community, and that everyone knew, and the deputy nodded politely in the way professionals do when someone is clearly wrong but unaware of it, and he asked again for documentation, and when none appeared he asked me for mine, and I retrieved the folder I now kept near the door showing the deed, the survey, and the correspondence from the county, and as the deputy reviewed the papers Karen hovered visibly agitated, muttering under her breath, and occasionally interjecting with commentary about intent and fairness and community harmony, until the second deputy asked her firmly to stop interrupting, and that moment visibly shocked her because she was not accustomed to being corrected by authority figures. She had summoned herself, and when the deputies finished reviewing the documents, the first one explained calmly that the lake was indeed private property, that I had every right to post signage, and that Karen was currently trespassing and needed to leave immediately, and the look on her face was something between disbelief and rage, as if reality itself had betrayed her, and she protested loudly, insisting they were misinterpreting the situation, that the HOA would correct this, that she would escalate further, and the deputy repeated himself more firmly, instructing her to leave now, and she finally did, stepping back reluctantly while continuing to argue and film on her phone, narrating loudly how she was being silenced and mistreated, and as she retreated up the path, still ranting, the deputy apologized to me for the disturbance, explaining that they had been called for a civil dispute, and that no violation had occurred on my part, and as they left I stood there looking at the lake again, calm and unchanged, and I thought perhaps this would finally end things, but entitlement rarely accepts correction gracefully, and I was proven right later that afternoon when I noticed fresh orange flags planted along the edge of my property near the lake, something that immediately raised concern because survey flags do not appear without reason, and when I walked closer I saw Karen again, this time with a man holding measuring equipment and a clipboard, and she announced loudly that she had hired a surveyor to prove the lake was shared property, and that she would settle this once and for all, and I asked the surveyor politely who had hired him and what he had been instructed to survey, and he looked uncomfortable, glancing between us before explaining that he had been hired to confirm boundary lines, and I informed him that I already had a certified survey on file, and asked if he had reviewed it, and he admitted he had not because Karen had told him it was unnecessary and that she needed an independent confirmation, and as we spoke Karen interrupted, insisting that prior surveys were outdated and biased, and that she needed proof that supported the community. And I calmly told the surveyor that he was welcome to review my documentation, but that he could not place markers on my land without permission, and he nodded, acknowledging that was correct, and turned to Karen, explaining that without my consent, and without contradictory evidence, he could not proceed, and that was when Karen lost control completely because she accused both of us of collusion, threatened to report the surveyor to his licensing board, and declared that she would not be ignored, and the surveyor quietly packed up his equipment, apologized again, and left, leaving Karen alone fuming beside the lake, and she turned on me screaming that I was obstructing justice, that I had manipulated authorities, and that she would expose me publicly and sue for emotional distress, and I listened until she finished, and then told her calmly that she needed to leave or I would call the sheriff again, and something in my tone must have registered, because she hesitated, clearly aware of how that had gone earlier, and she backed away reluctantly, hurling final threats about lawsuits and media and consequences before storming off once more, and as the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the water, I felt that shift again, the one where the struggle changes shape, because Karen had now failed at HOA pressure, law enforcement, intimidation, and professional validation, and each failure narrowed her options, leaving only one path left: public spectacle and revenge. And I knew then that she was no longer Trying to win, she was trying to hurt, and that realization brought a strange clarity, because when entitlement sheds all pretense, the response becomes simpler, boundaries become firmer, and consequences become inevitable. And as I stood there watching the lake settle back into stillness, I understood that the next chapter would not be loud at first, but it would be decisive, and Karen would soon learn that shouting does not rewrite reality and persistence does not replace ownership. Karen's next move arrived quietly at first, which in hindsight was the most dangerous phase, because instead of screaming at my shoreline or dragging officials into it, she went digital, and within a day neighbors started messaging me asking what was going on, because apparently I was now the villain of a rapidly spreading online narrative, where Karen had posted a long emotional rant complete with carefully cropped photos of my sign and the lake, framed to look menacing and exclusionary, and she painted herself as a community advocate standing up against a hostile landowner who hated families and targeted women, and the post spread fast because outrage always does, and people who had never set foot near the lake suddenly had strong opinions about my character and motives, and Karen fed it, constantly replying to comments, liking supportive messages, and hinting at legal action, while portraying herself as calm and reasonable despite the fact that anyone who had actually witnessed her behavior knew how far from reality that image was. And for a brief moment it was frustrating to watch misinformation gain traction, but frustration quickly gave way to something else, because unlike Karen I had facts, and unlike her I did not need volume to be heard, and when a neighbor forwarded me a screenshot showing she had publicly claimed the lake was shared HOA property, I realized she had crossed from exaggeration into defamation, and that changed the stakes entirely, because now her words were not just annoying, they were legally actionable, and I contacted my attorney, sending over the post's screenshots and a summary of events, and within hours he responded advising that a cease and desist would be appropriate and potentially very effective, and that suggestion felt less like escalation and more like correction, because Karen had been testing boundaries for weeks and now she had stepped far beyond them, and the letter went out that afternoon, professionally worded, clear and firm, outlining the fact ownership, jurisdiction, and demanding she stop making false claims and remove defamatory content immediately. And when she received it, the reaction was immediate and explosive, because instead of reflecting or backing down, she doubled down, posting about being threatened by lawyers and silenced by money and power, and claiming this proved everything she had said was true. And for a short while her supporters rallied louder, but something unexpected happened as well, because people began asking questions, requesting proof, pointing out inconsistencies, and sharing screenshots of public records showing the lake boundaries, and suddenly the narrative was no longer one-sided, and Karen responded the only way she knew how, by lashing out, attacking commenters, accusing them of betrayal and deleting posts that contradicted her claims, and that behavior raised red flags even among those initially sympathetic, because nothing eroded credibility faster than censorship paired with outrage. And as the online tide began to turn, Karen shifted tactics again, organizing a so-called peaceful demonstration at the lake, announcing that neighbors would gather to reclaim shared resources and promote inclusion, and that announcement concerned me not because I feared the gathering but because it represented another trespass attempt, and I informed my attorney, who advised me to notify local law enforcement ahead of time and ensure everything was documented. And on the day Karen had promised dozens of people, only a handful showed up, standing awkwardly at the path holding handmade signs, while Karen paced back and forth filming and narrating, and when deputies arrived they calmly explained that the gathering was on private property and needed to disperse. And that was the moment Karen's supporters visibly hesitated, because no one wants to be arrested for someone else's crusade, and one by one they backed away, leaving Karen standing alone again, fuming and shouting about corruption and injustice and filming, until the deputies instructed her to leave and warned her that further attempts could result in citations. And as she stormed off again, shouting that this was not over, I felt something settle, because each escalation had stripped away another layer of her imagined authority, and what remained was just noise. And that evening my attorney called to say that based on her continued behavior we could pursue further action, including a restraining order, if necessary. And while I hoped it would not come to That I also understood that consequences were now inevitable because Karen had chosen to make this public, and public conflicts tend to resolve themselves decisively, and as I sat by the lake that night watching the water reflect the fading sky, I thought about how simple this all could have been if she had respected a boundary from the beginning, and how complex it became because she refused to accept no, and I knew that the next chapter would be the final confrontation, not loud, not chaotic, but official and irreversible, because when entitlement collides with documented reality, the outcome is rarely dramatic in the way Karen preferred, but it is always final. The final shift began not with shouting or posts or threats, but with an envelope delivered quietly to Karen's doorstep, because while she was busy reacting emotionally, my attorney had been assembling a timeline, documents, screenshots, witness statements, and official records into something far more powerful than outrage, and that envelope contained a formal notice outlining defamation, trespass, harassment, and interference with property rights, and it demanded immediate compliance, removal of false statements, and cessation of all contact and activity related to my property, and unlike previous warnings, this one carried weight, because it referenced statutes, case law, and potential damages, and when Karen received it the response was delayed for the first time, which told me everything I needed to know, because silence from someone like her meant panic, and that panic surfaced 2 days later, when she appeared again at the lake, this time without an audience, without a phone raised, and without the usual volume, and she stood there, rigid, arms folded, face tight, trying to project confidence while clearly struggling to maintain it, and she told me she just wanted to talk, and that phrase coming from her carried more tension than any scream, because it meant she was trying to regain control through negotiation rather than force, and I listened while she attempted to reframe the entire conflict, claiming misunderstandings, exaggerations, and emotional stress, and suggesting compromises like shared access hours or removing the sign in exchange for peace, and I let her finish because letting her talk revealed the cracks in her position, and when she finally paused, waiting for agreement, I told her calmly that there would be no compromise because there had never been a shared right to negotiate, and that her actions had consequences that were already in motion, and the moment I mentioned the word consequences her composure faltered, and she accused me of ruining her reputation, threatening her family, and attacking her personally, and I responded simply that she had done all of that herself by refusing to respect boundaries and facts, and that statement landed harder than anything I had said before because it stripped away her victim narrative and left only responsibility, and she reacted with anger at first, then desperation, asking what I wanted, and I told her I wanted what I had always wanted: respect for private property and to be left alone, and that if she complied fully things could end quietly, but if not they would continue officially, and she left that day without another word, and within hours her online posts vanished one by one, the comments disabled, the narrative erased, as if it had never existed, and neighbors noticed because sudden silence after weeks of noise is impossible to miss, and questions began circulating privately about what had happened, and while I did not gossip, the facts traveled anyway because truth tends to move even when you do not push it. And then came the final confirmation when the sheriff office served Karen with a formal warning regarding repeated trespass and harassment, outlining that any further contact or presence on my property would result in citations and potential arrest, and that document marked the end of her leverage because authority had spoken clearly and not in her favor, and the HOA quietly updated its records clarifying jurisdiction boundaries, and sent a neutral notice reminding residents to respect private property, which was as close to an admission as they would ever make, and the lake returned to its quiet rhythm, boats drifting, birds nesting, mornings peaceful again, and weeks passed without incident, and that absence spoke louder than any confrontation, because Karen power had always depended on constant pressure, and without it she had nothing, and the final moment came unexpectedly when I encountered her at a local store, and she avoided eye contact, walking quickly past, no clipboard, no phone, no entourage, just another person suddenly ordinary and constrained by the same rules she had once tried to bend, and in that moment I understood that the real consequence was not legal or public, but internal, because entitlement relies on the illusion of special treatment, and once that illusion shatters it does not easily return, and as summer settled in and the sign remained weathered but clear, I watched families walk past the fence, glance at the words, and keep moving. And I felt no guilt, because boundaries are not cruelty. They are clarity, and clarity is what had been missing from this community until someone finally said no and meant it, and in that quiet certainty I realized that the story had reached its turning point, not with a scream or a post but with acceptance, and while Karen might never admit she was wrong, her absence said enough, and the lake remained private, peaceful, and finally respected, and that was the only ending it ever needed. The weeks after Karen's disappearance from the shoreline did not feel triumphant at first. They felt strangely quiet in a way that made everyone cautious, as if the neighborhood itself was waiting to see whether the storm would return, and during that pause I began noticing how much her constant pressure had shaped daily routines, because neighbors who once wandered freely now hesitated at the fence, reading the sign twice before continuing on, and conversations that used to revolve around complaint shifted toward ordinary topics like weather, fishing, and summer plans, and that subtle change was telling because it revealed how much tension had been normalized until it was suddenly gone, and I realized that Chapter 7 was not about confrontation at all but about the aftershocks of entitlement collapsing and how people recalibrate once a loud controlling force is removed, and that recalibration surfaced in small, unexpected ways. Like when a neighbor stopped by with a homemade pie apologizing for believing rumors and admitting they had never actually checked the facts, or when another quietly asked if the lake had always been private and listened carefully this time when I explained, because without Karen framing the story people were finally hearing it clearly, and even the HOA began behaving differently, sending out neutral updates, avoiding personal language, and staying firmly within their defined scope, which confirmed that her absence had altered their internal dynamics as well. Because fear of her reactions had clearly influenced decisions before, and now that fear was gone, and the most telling moment came during a casual gathering, when someone joked about how quiet things had been lately and another replied that it was nice not to feel policed, and laughter followed, not cruel or mocking but relieved, and that laughter marked a turning point, because it meant the community had moved from conflict into reflection, and in that reflection people recognized patterns they had previously excused, and I did not need to point them out because reality had done that work already, and even though Karen never returned to the lake, her presence lingered in conversations as a cautionary tale about overreach and assumption and the danger of mistaking volume for authority, and during that time I also reflected on my own role, realizing that the sign had become more than a boundary marker. It had become a symbol of clarity and honesty, because it said what needed to be said without shouting, and that simplicity had ultimately disarmed a complex mess of manipulation and misinformation, and I kept expecting another move from her, a new tactic, a quiet complaint, an indirect pressure, but nothing came, and that absence confirmed what the attorney had explained earlier, that when consequences are clearly defined and enforced consistently, people like Karen often retreat completely, because without ambiguity they cannot operate. And as summer deepened and the lake filled with the sounds of nature rather than arguments, I felt a sense of closure forming, not dramatic or celebratory, but grounded and earned, and that feeling was reinforced when I received confirmation that the restraining measures were formally closed due to compliance, meaning Karen had followed every condition without protest, and while some might view that as a small administrative detail, to me it represented the final acceptance of limits, and during a quiet evening walk along the fence, I noticed the sign had faded slightly from sun and weather, and considered whether to replace it, but decided against it because its purpose had been fulfilled, and its presence now served as a reminder rather than a provocation, and that distinction mattered because Chapter 7 was about stability returning, not conflict continuing, and the true resolution of entitlement is not punishment but irrelevance, and Karen had become irrelevant to the lake, the neighborhood, and the narrative she once tried to dominate, and the most Unexpected confirmation came when I overheard a parent explaining to a child why they could not swim there, and instead of complaining they nodded accepting the explanation, because boundaries explained calmly are rarely challenged, and that simple moment encapsulated everything that had gone wrong before and everything that had gone right afterward, and as the sun dipped low and reflected gold across the water I understood that this chapter was the calm before the ending, not because something else was coming but because endings require space to be recognized and acknowledged, and the space created by her absence allowed everyone including me to recognize what had been learned and what had changed and why it mattered, and as the lake settled into its quiet rhythm again free from entitlement and accusation I knew that the final chapter would not need escalation or surprise because the most powerful ending had already unfolded in silence and acceptance, and the understanding that private does not mean hostile, and no does not mean cruel, it simply means no, and that lesson once learned does not need repeating. The ending arrived quietly the way real endings usually do, not with confrontation or applause but with routine returning to its proper shape, and on a cool morning, when the lake lay perfectly still reflecting the sky without interruption, I realized it had been months since anyone mentioned Karen's name at all, and that absence felt complete, not tense or temporary, but settled, as if the entire episode had folded itself into the past, where it belonged, and I walked the shoreline checking the fence out of habit more than necessity, noticing how grass had grown back where people once cut through, and how the path Karen used to storm down had softened from lack of traffic, and even the birds seemed less startled now, nesting freely along the water edge, and in that calm I understood that what had truly ended was not just a dispute but a pattern, because the lake had become a boundary that taught a lesson far beyond property lines, and neighbors who once hesitated now greeted me easily. Conversations flowed without side glances and assumptions, and the community had recalibrated in subtle but meaningful ways, because when entitlement collapses it leaves space for normalcy to return, and I saw that normalcy in small interactions, like a family thanking me for explaining boundaries kindly, or an HOA notice that stayed strictly factual without emotional language or power posturing, and those changes mattered because they proved the conflict had produced growth rather than bitterness. And I also noticed something else. Karen had not been replaced because her role had never been necessary, it had only felt inevitable until it was gone, and that realization reframed everything, because the lake did not need a gatekeeper shouting rules, it only needed clear ownership and consistency, and the sign, weathered now, sun faded but still legible, stood as a quiet marker, not of exclusion but of clarity, and I decided to leave it exactly as it was, because removing it would invite confusion again, and confusion is where entitlement thrives. And one afternoon, as I sat on the dock watching ripples spread from a fish breaking the surface, I thought about how simple this story would sound if summarized, and how complex it felt while living through it, because the hardest part had never been legal or procedural, it had been emotional, resisting the pressure to explain endlessly, to justify, to appease, and to smooth over behavior that did not deserve accommodation, and learning that lesson had changed how I approached boundaries everywhere, because saying no once clearly had proven more effective than saying yes reluctantly 100 times, and that lesson extended beyond the lake into daily life conversations, expectations, and self-respect, and I realized that Karen's greatest consequence was not the legal warnings or the social retreat, but the fact that her tactics no longer worked on anyone, because people had seen the pattern play out fully, from outrage to collapse, and patterns once recognized lose their power. And weeks later, when I heard through a neighbor that Karen had listed her house and planned to move, I felt no triumph, only a quiet sense of closure, because relocation does not fix entitlement but it does remove its immediate reach, and the community she left behind was calmer, more grounded, and less reactive, and that mattered more than any personal vindication. And the lake continued its rhythm. Seasons shifted, leaves fell and returned, and the sign remained a simple sentence that had sparked far more than it ever claimed, and standing there on the final evening of summer watching the sky darken and stars begin to reflect in the water, I understood that this story was never really about a Karen or an HOA or even a lake. It was about the power of clear boundaries enforced calmly and consistently, and the way reality eventually asserts itself no matter how loudly someone argues against it. And the final image I carry is not of shouting or threats or meetings, but of silence earned. Silence that feels safe and complete and rightful, and as the water lapped gently against the dock, I smiled, not because I had won but because peace had returned and stayed, and that was the only ending worth having.